A recruit forced to live with a fractured neck. Another had his legs and genitals amputated. What do they have in common? They were violently hazed in the Russian military. The Russian armed forces have tried to move away from a conscription service ever since the early 2000s, when it became clear that if they were to compete against professional Western militaries, they would need their own fully volunteer military force. Historically, conscripts have vastly underperformed versus professional soldiers due to worse morale and esprit de corps. But conscription also severely weakens a military in one key area: expertise. When a military over-relies on conscripts, it's reduced to a constantly rotating body of soldiers, which leaves that military without any professional veterans. This lack of veterancy severely negatively impacts the performance of any military and leads to a weak non-commissioned or junior officer corps, a problem Russia is intimately familiar with and largely explains its terrible performance in Ukraine. Russia has been unable to transition to an all-volunteer military, despite efforts to boost pay and benefits. However, it has managed to reduce its dependency on conscripts greatly. Today, about a third of the Russian military is made up of conscripts, and these conscripts are typically assigned to rear area jobs such as logistics, maintenance, and artillery corps. Russia's frontline forces, at least in theory, are fully professional, and under Russian law, conscripts cannot be used for military action outside of Russia's borders. As we've seen in Ukraine, though, Russian law means little, even for Russians, as conscripts make up a significant portion of the forces fighting there. Russia has 2 conscription drives a year. The first is in the fall and lasts from October to December 31st, and the second is in the spring, lasting from April 1st to July 15th. All men aged 18 to 27 are eligible for conscription, though teenagers as young as 16 have been pressed into service. Corruption is prevalent throughout the length and breadth of the Russian military, however, and conscripts can often pay as much as $5,000 US to avoid service, which inevitably means that most conscripts come from working-class homes, single-parent families, or orphanages. Wealthier Russians need not fear compulsory service, despite the fact that the Russian constitution explicitly states every Russian's job should be to defend the motherland. Would-be conscripts even go so far as to swallow magnesium crystals to give themselves painful stomach ulcers and avoid the draft, or add drops of blood to their urine samples hoping it'll make them seem unfit for service. Conscripts serve for 1-year terms, though extensions such as that which many in Ukraine are facing today are not uncommon. Upon enlisting, conscripts go through a 1 to 2 month-long basic training, which varies depending on location and is not standardized the way it is in the US. After basic training, conscripts undergo a further 3 to 6 months of advanced training, depending on their assignment, before being assigned to regular units. Russian conscripts must pass a physical examination similar to that required by many Western militaries. This includes a 3-kilometer run that must be finished in 12.4 minutes, a 10-kilometer march that must be completed in less than 56 minutes, a 100-meter dash in under 14.4 seconds, and 12 pull-ups for any soldier in service less than 6 months. For their service, they're paid up to $14 US a month, though this varies. Once more, corruption is to blame, as Russia uses a system where unit commanders are directly sent the wages for their soldiers, and it's up to them to disseminate pay. Thus, most Russian commanders skim off the top of the incoming pay largely from the conscripts, who will be gone in a few months anyway, and who have little to no rights inside the Russian military. The curious practice also explains much of the underperformance of the Russian battalion tactical groups in the current war. Officers routinely report their units are fully staffed and fit for combat, despite having suffered combat losses. This way, senior officers can pocket the pay meant for soldiers who have been killed or wounded and removed from the front. Then, when the unit is tapped for combat operations because to senior planners it seems like a full-strength unit, it must go to combat with a percentage of its manpower missing. Training during boot camp is split between physical training, weapons training, and unit training. Unlike American boot camp, there's a far less rigid training structure, and it seems like a lot of training is focused on physical training to get conscripts and recruits into shape. By comparison, US basic training differs depending on the branch of service, but focuses on weapons training and physical training alongside classroom training on topics ranging from the law of armed conflict to first aid. Russian recruits also tend to have less oversight during basic training and enjoy relaxing evenings after official training hours are over, even being allowed to watch TV or listen to music until lights out at 10:30. But the real challenge for conscripts isn't training, it's surviving Dedovshchina, the rule of the grandfathers. Russians believe that the rule of the grandfathers makes for tough soldiers. Their performance in Ukraine begs to differ. Hazing inside the Russian military is not limited to conscripts, but conscripts bear the absolute worst of it. The practice is perpetrated by everyone from senior to junior officers, who ignore it or participate in it directly, and even by soldiers just a few years more senior than their victims. No one is safe from hazing in the Russian military, but hazing isn't just about abuse, it's often about outright theft or exploitation. One recruit, Kirill Bobrov, at the Kamenka military base was dragged into a boiler room after his compatriots found out that his grandmother had sent him $14 US in rubles. The drunk soldiers wanted the money for themselves so they could spend it on cigarettes, alcohol, and sweets, and they began to interrogate him on where he'd hidden the money. Bobrov claimed he'd already spent it, but the soldiers didn't believe him, so they began to beat him. As he took the beating and refused to give up the money, one soldier picked up a wooden chair and smashed it directly on Bobrov's head, striking his neck. This would lead to a spinal fracture, which would be completely untreated by the military doctors he reported it to after complaining of extreme pain. They chalked it up to nerves and sent him back to his unit. Bobrov describes being continuously beaten on by senior soldiers and junior officers. They would often get drunk and drag recruits out of their bunks for random beatings to entertain themselves. Few stools or chairs were unbroken inside the barracks, as they'd all been used to beat the recruits with. On his very first night in the barracks, Bobrov was woken by his sergeant and dragged out of bed only to be punched in the stomach and head several times. When he collapsed on the ground, the sergeant then proceeded to kick him in the stomach. Other soldiers would round up the new recruits and order them to fetch them cigarettes with filters within 30 minutes, which was impossible as the base was remote and nowhere near a shopping center. Plus, conscripts are paid pithy sums each month, which is what made the $14 US gift from his grandmother so valuable to Bobrov. It was several months' wages at once. Other times, the recruits would be ordered to bring soldiers money. If they failed, which was often, they were severely beaten. Bobrov would go on to develop a severe infection in his legs that made marching extremely painful. He attempted to escape from the base 3 times, finally successfully fleeing and heading to St. Petersburg, where he contacted an advocacy group called the Soldiers' Mothers Organization. The group sent him to a hospital to get his injuries documented so he could be reported as unfit for service. It's there they found that Bobrov suffered from multiple traumas and concussions, as well as the spinal fracture in his neck. Another soldier, Private Andrei Sichov, described being tied to a chair by his drunk superiors and beaten repeatedly over the course of a night. The only breaks he got was as his seniors returned to their drinking binge, before inevitably coming back to continue the beating. He wisely did not report the situation, but when he reported to the military doctor for treatment of his injuries, the doctor said he was fine. A few days later, gangrene had spread to most of his wounds, and he ended up having both his legs and genitalia amputated. New recruits are often given extremely poor quality uniforms, which helps identify them as duhi, or ghosts. Soldiers who have served for at least 2 years are referred to as old-timers, while anyone past that is known as dede, or grandfather. Without a professional NCO corps, and with most Russian officers too busy working second jobs to pay the cost of their own uniforms and supplies, it's the dedes who are in charge of the barracks, and it's them who are the worst offenders and perpetrators of this systemic abuse. Recruits aren't just abused and have their personal belongings and even wages stolen from them, though. They're also exploited by their superiors. Recruits are often forced to work for locals doing manual labor, for which the locals will pay their senior soldiers, who give nothing to the duhi. This is far from the worst fate, as new recruits are often prostituted out, an appalling practice that's been described as endemic inside the Russian military and is ironic for a culture that is so violently anti-gay. New recruits can face some pretty horrifying and disgusting non-physical abuse, though, as well. They can be sleep-deprived for days or weeks at a time, forced to wake up in the middle of the night and go for runs or do push-ups for hours on end. Sometimes they might be forced to run with little clothing in blistering winter conditions, which leads to frostbite, at times severe enough to require amputations. Recruits are often starved, with their food taken by senior soldiers, much like school lunch bullies. However, one of the foulest abuses is the practice of forcing recruits to scrub toilets with a toothbrush. But if you're picturing the pristine porcelain thrones of American basic training, think again. These toilets are often simple holes in the ground, which must be scrubbed clean. If the abuser is particularly sadistic, they'll then force the recruit to brush his teeth with the same toothbrush afterwards. Over time, though, the West has become aware of the most common hazing practices. The first is known as the elephant. This ritual gets its name from the older generation Russian gas mask, which has a trunk-like tube through which a soldier breathes. A recruit will be forced to put on the mask and then have the other end sealed off, cutting off the air supply. The recruit is then forced to recite army regulations, sing patriotic songs, or do PT until they physically pass out. When the mask is unsealed and the recruit takes their first breath, they're immediately punched in the solar plexus. The next practice is known as the Batman. This involves a recruit lying on the bottom bunk of a bunk bed-style army cot. Then they hang on to the top bunk with both their arms and legs and must hold for as long as possible. Several recruits will do the Batman at once, and the last one to let go is spared physical abuse. The first to let go is given the most abuse. The ritual known as the Crazy Deer involves a recruit being ordered to cross their hands over their forehead and bang their head against a wall repeatedly. Inevitably, this leads to concussions, which can be severe. The hazing ritual that led to the amputation of Andrei Sichov's legs and genitalia is known as the television. Here the recruit sits on a stool while holding another stool with a cup of water balanced on it. The stool he's sitting on is then pulled out from under him, and if the recruit wobbles and lets the cup of water fall, he's severely beaten. The ritual is named the television due to the fact that the recruit intently stares at the cup of water balanced on the stool he's holding while waiting for the stool underneath him to be pulled away. The bicycle involves waiting for a recruit to fall asleep, after which he has pieces of paper rolled together and put between his toes. Then the papers are set on fire. The way the recruit reacts by kicking his legs violently once his feet begin to burn is how the ritual gets its name. The confiscation is simple. Anything that a duha sent by his family or friends belongs to the older soldiers, who steal everything. The recruit could tell his family and friends to simply send him nothing, except the older soldiers often force them to ask for specific things, and then steal it once it arrives. Next is the dried crocodile, a variation on the Batman. This one involves the recruit suspending himself face down between two bunk beds. Then an AK with a bayonet fixed to it is placed pointing up directly under the recruit. The recruit must cling on for dear life or fall onto the bayonet. Often other soldiers will beat the recruit with pillows trying to get him to fall. The ritual gets its name for the way the suspended recruit looks like a crocodile skin that's been stretched out to dry in the sun. Russian equipment is still largely outdated, which makes the birdie possible. In this ritual, the wires of an old 1930s field telephone is wrapped around two big toes of a recruit. The telephones work by hand cranking, which generates an electrical charge and inevitably shocks the recruit. The harder the phone is cranked, the worse the charge. Billiards is a particularly brutal form of torture. Here, a recruit is ordered to put a billiards ball in his mouth while a soldier whacks it with a pool cue. This inevitably results in missing or chipped teeth. However, another variant of the torture involves forcing the recruit to bend over and drop their pants, and we'll leave the rest to your imagination. The pheasant, however, marks the final torture ritual one must undergo before graduating out of being a duha. In this ritual, the recruit drops his pants and crouches on the legs of an upside-down bench. The older soldiers will then line up and whip his bare butt with metal belt buckles. A recruit must endure 100 lashes to graduate, and if they fall off the bench, they must undergo the entire ritual all over again. Inevitably, all this torture comes with severe consequences. Recruits face lifelong injuries and even extreme amputations, as we saw earlier, with mental disorders not being out of the norm. Suicide is endemic to the Russian armed forces, however, most of it resulting from the practice of dedovshchina. But sometimes the recruits turn their weapons on their tormentors. There have been multiple incidents of recruits killing their fellow soldiers before attempting to flee to the countryside. Soviet Union veterans admit that severe hazing was always a practice in the Red Army, but it has increased exponentially in cruelty ever since the fall of the Soviet Union due to the underfunded state of the Russian military. Russia is not just too economically poor to field the large military that it has, but it's also plagued by rampant corruption, which means funds don't always make it to their designated units. With senior officers too worried about making a living by working a second job, discipline has absolutely crumbled inside the Russian military. The result is not just that life is a living hell for Russian conscripts and even professional soldiers, but that the Russian military is an incompetent mess that is incapable of subduing its far less capable neighbor, Ukraine. Now go watch What's Wrong with the Russian Military, or click this other video instead.